No bombs fell. No troops crossed a border. And yet, a country is being dismantled piece by piece right in front of us. What if I told you that modern war no longer begins with missiles, but with oil tankers, bank accounts, and access to markets? I want you to pause for a moment, because what's happening to Venezuela is not about ideology. It's not even about diplomacy. It's about something far more precise: control. Control over energy, control over revenue, control over survival. The United States is no longer trying to occupy territory. It is occupying purse strings. Tankers are seized in international waters. Oil sales are permitted or denied based on whether they serve American interests. No invasion, no body bags, just pressure so intense that sovereignty itself becomes conditional. This is not a sanction regime. It is a system. And if you think this only affects Venezuela, stay with me, because by the end of this analysis, you'll see how this mechanism is reshaping power far beyond one country. To understand how we arrived here, we first need to clearly define the problem the United States says it is trying to solve. So what is the problem really that Washington claims it is solving? Officially, the answer sounds familiar: an authoritarian regime aligned with America's adversaries, destabilizing the Western Hemisphere. But that explanation is incomplete, because regimes like this have existed before without triggering this level of economic force. The real issue is not who governs Venezuela. It is what Venezuela controls. Oil is the center of gravity, not as a commodity, but as leverage. Every barrel sold outside American control strengthens relationships with China, Russia, and Iran. Every dollar earned without oversight weakens U.S. influence in its own hemisphere. From this perspective, Venezuela is not treated as a political problem. It is treated as a resource management failure, one that must be corrected. That's why the language matters. Purse strings, energy access, national interest. These are not metaphors. They are operating principles. Once you see the problem framed this way, the actions that follow, seizures, blockades, conditional permissions, stop looking extreme. They start looking inevitable. To understand how we reach this moment, you have to see the longer arc, not of politics, but of economics. For decades, Venezuela's oil was treated as a symbol of sovereignty. Control the resource, control the nation's destiny. But over time, mismanagement, isolation, and dependency hollowed that promise out. Production collapsed. Infrastructure decayed. Output fell to a fraction of what the country once produced. That collapse created a vacuum. And in global systems, vacuums never remain empty. As Venezuela weakened, its oil didn't disappear, it changed direction. Discounted barrels began flowing toward actors willing to defy U.S. pressure. China, Iran, Russia. Not as charity, but as survival. Oil became currency. Alignment became payment. At the same time, the United States learned from earlier failures. Iraq taught Washington what not to do. Destroy the state, and chaos follows. Occupy the country, and resistance hardens. So a different model emerged, one that doesn't touch the ground. If you can control how oil moves, who buys it, and where the money lands, you don't need soldiers. You just need access. The theory became real the moment the tankers were taken, not sanctioned on paper, not warned, seized. 2 oil tankers linked directly to Venezuela were physically intercepted, taken out of circulation, removed from the system. This wasn't diplomacy, it wasn't symbolism, it was enforcement. And that's the moment everything changed. Because sanctions can be evaded, paper rules can be bent, but when ships are seized in international waters, the message is unmistakable. Access is no longer negotiable. The logic was brutally simple. Oil is the regime's lifeline. Cut the flow, and you don't just apply pressure, you define survival. Control the revenue stream, and political outcomes begin to bend without a single shot fired. What made this moment explosive wasn't just the seizure itself. It was what it revealed. The United States was willing to move beyond declarations and into direct action without crossing into conventional war. No invasion, no troops, no casualties, just a financial chokehold tightened in full view of the world. And quietly, a line was crossed from economic pressure to economic domination. What looks like chaos is actually a system precise, repeatable, and cold. At the center of it is a simple rule: access replaces sovereignty. Venezuela is no longer told what it cannot do. It is told what it may do conditionally. You can sell oil, but only if it serves American national interest. That single condition changes everything, because sovereignty normally means choice. Here, choice is revoked. Revenue exists only with permission. Markets open only with compliance. This is why the phrase controlling the purse strings matters. It signals a shift from punishment to management. The Venezuelan state is no longer treated as an adversary to be defeated, but as an entity to be administrated, its economic oxygen regulated from the outside. And once that mechanism is in place, pressure becomes invisible. There are no explosions, no emergency sessions, no headlines screaming war, just stalled payments, blocked tankers, frozen access. The brilliance and the danger of this model is that it scales. It doesn't rely on force projection, it relies on gatekeeping. Whoever controls the gates decides who survives the system. That's why this isn't about Venezuela alone. It's a template. Once the gates closed, evasion became the only option. That's when the deception began. A tanker quietly changed its identity, its flag, its paperwork. It sailed as something it wasn't: a Russian oil tanker. The assumption was clear: American forces would not risk a confrontation with Moscow over a single ship. For a time, the strategy worked. Millions of barrels moved through the system. Oil flowed to China, to Iran. The blockade leaked. Then the illusion collapsed. U.S. intelligence identified the deception. The ship wasn't Russian. It was Venezuelan wearing Russian cover. And despite explicit warnings from Moscow to stop following it, the United States took the tanker anyway. That moment mattered more than the oil on board, because it shattered two beliefs at once. First, that flag hopping could still protect sanctioned assets. Second, that Russian deterrence in the Western Hemisphere was credible. There was no negotiation, no standoff, no response. Just action. In one move, Washington demonstrated that even great power signaling would not override enforcement of the blockade. The message wasn't subtle. This system has rules, and disguises don't change them. Now I want you to think about the people who never touched a tanker, never signed a contract, never chose an alliance, because when oil stops moving, life does too. Hospitals don't collapse overnight, but supplies thin. Paychecks arrive late. Electricity becomes unreliable. The pressure doesn't announce itself. It seeps in quietly, relentlessly. This is how economic warfare reaches the street. Not with sirens, but with shortages. Not with headlines, but with uncertainty. The system tightens, and ordinary people absorb the shock long before leaders feel it. And here's the uncomfortable truth. This pressure is not accidental. It's the mechanism. The expectation is that economic pain will translate into political fracture, that survival itself becomes a bargaining chip. You are meant to feel the weight of that choice, because this model doesn't ask whether people suffer. It asks whether suffering produces compliance. And once a population becomes the lever, the line between strategy and morality blurs fast. What happened in the Caribbean didn't stay there, because oil doesn't just power countries. It binds systems. When Venezuelan shipments are cut, redirected, or seized, the shock doesn't hit one regime. It travels across supply chains. China loses discounted barrels. Iran loses quiet lifelines. Russia loses another client it cannot protect. And suddenly, alignment becomes expensive. This is where the strategy widens. Secondary sanctions turn buyers into targets. Neutrality disappears. Countries that thought they were outside the conflict, Brazil, Turkey, even major economies, are forced to choose between access to American finance and access to sanctioned energy. That choice reshapes behavior fast. What looks like a regional enforcement action becomes a global sorting mechanism. Who trades with whom? Who ensures which cargo? Which ports stay open? Which currencies clear? The system doesn't need consensus. It needs compliance. And as markets adjust, alliances strain. Trust erodes. Every actor recalculates risk not based on ideology, but on exposure. This is power exercised at scale, not through conquest, but through connection. When the hub tightens, every spoke feels it. From here, the system points toward three possible futures. The first is managed compliance. Venezuela accepts conditional access, oil flows again under supervision, production rises, markets stabilize, prices fall. The regime survives, but sovereignty is hollowed out. The state functions, but only inside boundaries drawn elsewhere. Order returns, but it is rented, not owned. The second is prolonged resistance. Evasion continues, flag changes, shadow shipping, quiet buyers. The pressure never fully breaks, but it never fully succeeds either. The population absorbs the cost. The system grinds on. Stability erodes slowly, not explosively. No resolution, just exhaustion. The third is systemic rupture. Alliances fracture. Secondary sanctions expand. Buyers retreat. Revenue collapses beyond repair. The economic structure fails faster than political adaptation can keep up. At that point, outcomes are no longer controlled, they're triggered. None of these paths require an invasion. That's the defining feature. The future isn't decided by armies. It's decided by access, by who can sell, who can buy, who can clear a transaction. This is what power looks like when violence becomes optional. What you've just seen isn't a policy debate. It's a preview. A world where war no longer needs permission from history, where power doesn't announce itself with troops, but with terms and conditions, where sovereignty isn't invaded, it's priced. This doctrine doesn't ask who is right. It asks who controls access. Venezuela is the test case, but the mechanism doesn't stop there. Oil today, markets tomorrow, supply chains next. Once a system learns it can discipline states without firing a shot, restraint becomes a choice, not a rule. And that should force all of us to think differently. Because if survival depends on serving someone else's national interest, independence becomes symbolic, and when symbols replace substance, power moves quietly until it's everywhere. The question is no longer whether this strategy works. It's how often it will be used. If you want to understand the next decade of geopolitics, who rises, who bends, who disappears, you need to watch how resources are controlled, not how speeches are written. This is where the future is being decided,